Well, as we come to the end of the week, maybe I want to begin by apologizing if I have kind of picked the scab in some of your lives. When we talk about husbands of one wife, of being divorced and all those dynamics, I know that's a painful topic for a lot of you because you've gone through that trauma. Some of you were the victims, for the most part. You didn't want it, you didn't ask for it, and you had to deal with the consequences of somebody who was unfaithful to you. And I'm sensitive to that. I don't hold that over anybody. And at the same time, some of you know that you were responsible. I mean, you could have hung in there, you could have worked harder, you could have made it happen, but you decided for whatever reasons that you didn't want to go forward. I'll never forget years ago having a man come to me and wanting me to give him permission to divorce his wife because after they had gotten married, she had gained a great deal of weight. And I mean, I was kind of puzzled by his question. I was saying, well, that's not a biblical basis. And maybe you need to really kind of focus on what's going on. Well, the sad thing was shortly after he left our church, and I remember later on finding out that he was a leader in another church. He had divorced his wife, married a younger, slimmer one, and even as I was having lunch with his pastor, how this all came to the surface, the pastor had no idea that he had been previously married. And I thought to myself, well, it's probably a question you should have asked. But I think this is a person who, I don't mean to be unkind, but really, really shouldn't be in a position of leadership. I pray that he's repentant. I pray that he turned away from that sinfulness and solved the wrong of it. But the bottom line is, these things matter. That the first and foremost place that Paul says we need to really measure people's spiritual maturity is what's going on in their marital life. Where is that at? And if you're in ministry and your marriage is a train wreck, then you need to really focus on that and not ignore it and think it's not something that's of importance. But when he talks about being the husband of one wife, that raises all sorts of other questions about what qualifies or disqualifies somebody to be in pastoral ministry. The first question we have to ask is, does it imply that a pastor has to be married? What about a single man who is serving in ministry leadership? And it does not imply that. It's not saying you have to be married. And we all know that Paul, although he was undoubtedly previously married, we'll get into that conversation maybe further on, but he wasn't married at the time. He very clearly tells us he was living a life of singleness. And I don't know that Paul would have been a widower. I think there's a much stronger suggestion in the text that his wife had divorced him because of his conversion to Christianity and moving away from Judaism. That's kind of how it worked in the Pharisaical world of his day, that even up until current times, people are considered dead if they leave the Jewish faith and become Christian. So I think undoubtedly that's what happened to Paul. So the idea that you can't be a single person doesn't mean that you're disqualified from being a pastoral leader. But at the same time, it raises some important questions, because I've known individuals who are pastors and they're not married, and they've admitted that when it comes to dealing with issues of family and marriage and all sorts, they're outsiders. They don't have any kind of personal perspective. They haven't been through that journey themselves, and they often have to refer to people who do have that life experience. That's why I think even within the liturgical churches, particularly the Roman Catholic Church, that says, a priest can't be married, not only does that have absolutely no biblical basis, it has an awful lot to commend it to being a bad idea. When we talk about the problems of homosexuality and pedophilia within the Roman Catholic Church and their leadership, it's not surprising that you would find that even in their seminaries, they find that homosexual behavior is oftentimes become rampant and a serious problem, because it's an attractant to people who don't want to be married but want to have that kind of same-sex relationship, which the Bible condemns as being a damnable offense. So saying all of that, it's really important that we understand where the boundaries are. It's far more likely, and most commentators largely agree, that it really was a restriction against polygamy, because in the culture of the time, the idea of having more than one wife was not an uncommon dynamic, and it's simply saying it can't be a man who has multiple wives. So if you're a Mormon, I guess you're going to find yourself challenged by that fact. But the whole point is that it's a disqualifier. I said Joseph Smith and Brigham Young were disqualified because they were polygamists. But it also, again, does not mean that if a man is a widower that he cannot remarry. I would argue, and I think there's a good biblical argument, that the idea that people cannot remarry, even in cases where they were the victims of divorce, is not biblically sound. It certainly wasn't even in the purview of the early church, and certainly not of first century Judaism, that somebody who had lost their spouse could not remarry. That was just really kind of an unthinkable idea. The obligation to marriage was really right up center and forward with everybody. So all of these things are really critical. But again, what is really the thing that he's concerned about? It's the idea that there's integrity within the marriage bond. And that, of course, brings up another question that has become increasingly common within the church. What do you do when a pastor goes through a divorce? Does that automatically disqualify him or her to be in a position of leadership? Well, I would say that when I was younger, that was a simpler answer. I would simply say, yeah, he probably is disqualified and shouldn't do that. And yet, having lived life and walked through this with some people that I know, I think there's some questions we have to ask. Is the divorce the fault of the person, of the pastor? Because the reality is that sometimes they're unable to control the dynamic. Sometimes people who have free moral agency make the decision that they do not want to walk with God, that they want to give place to sin, and we can have a long discussion about what's the motive behind that. But the simple fact is that biblically, I do not think that a person who is the victim of divorce should be punished because they are a victim, because then we're just victimizing them twice. And so I think it's really important for us to realize that if a spiritual leader goes through a divorce, the first question we have to ask is, whose fault was it? And again, as I say, that we can never say it's no fault, but basically for a marriage to fall apart, somebody has to decide that they don't want to be married anymore. And that becomes the guilty party, because you may be able to say all sorts of negative things about the individual. And certainly that is something that has to be conversed. But the simple fact is that people go through divorces sometimes because the person they're married to decides they don't want to walk with God. And sadly, sometimes maybe they never knew the Lord in the first place. Raises all sorts of conversations and questions. But I think that first of all, we need to simply say we can't automatically say that's a clear disqualifier. In fact, I have pastoral friends who have gone through that experience and are in ministry to this day and still remarried, and they're still being powerfully used by God. So I don't think that necessarily is always the case. Secondly, I think that we have to wonder about, as I said, who's ultimately responsible for it. Thirdly, we need to recognize that divorce is not a life sentence or an unending disqualifier. I think that anybody who goes through a divorce experience has to have a point in their life where they can be restored, because emotionally and psychologically, and it's so devastating to go through. I think that you have to have a space. And I think that too often in the church, what we want to do is just discard people and say, well, you can no longer be in leadership. And we just cast them out of the ministry. Where I think that in many, I would say, more informed and mature ministries, there are some Christian evangelical churches which have really developed some pretty great policies on how do they restore pastors who have gone through these seasons. And that's the whole idea, realizing the gifts and callings of God are without repentance. But at the same time, so in other words, God doesn't take that calling away, he doesn't take those gifts away, but the person needs to be able to have a season in which they can go through healing and restoration. And that's why I would think that I would look at an example of the Apostle Paul. I am convinced the Apostle Paul went through a divorce. And I would say that because when we look at the position that he holds, he was undoubtedly the rabbi of the synagogue of the Libertines in Jerusalem. Paul said that he had excelled above all of his peers, so he was at a place where he was actually under direct accountability to the Sanhedrin, the high priest, the governing council of the Jewish people. That required in Judaism for you to be married. you could not get to that position and not be a married man, a single man. The whole idea was beyond unthinkable in the Jewish world. So Paul had to have been married. So what happened to his marriage? Well, he says, because of his conversion, he suffered the loss of everything, which I think not only meant his career, his position, his future within Judaism, but also more specifically, I would say it really brought to an end his marriage and his family life and those connections, so that essentially when he says, I lost everything, I think he includes in that his wife and probably even his children. And that was such a devastating loss. And yet the reason Paul is sent to Cilicia away from Jerusalem is not because he had lost his family, but it was because he had his life was in danger. So I think we have a real key example of Paul, who was not really kind of discounted and discarded because he had gone through this. I'm sure the divorce was not his choice, but it was something that he was subjected to. And I think the church understood that and realized that this was part of the cost of conversion and not something that became a lifelong disqualifier. So those are my thoughts. Look forward to continuing as we talk about being temperate next week. Blessings.